It was a late afternoon when the man finished his work at the downtown office. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the streets with long, soft shadows. He had just stepped out of the building, carrying a leather bag with his laptop and some papers from the day. The city hummed around him. Cars moved slowly in the traffic, and the occasional chatter of people walking past filled the air. He had a simple plan: get to his car, drive home, and enjoy a quiet evening. As he walked towards the parking lot, 2 police cars came into view. They slowed down and parked near the entrance. He didn't think much of it at first. Police presence in the city was common, especially during busy hours. But as he got closer, he noticed that the officers in one of the cars were watching him closely. Their eyes followed his every move. He felt a subtle tension in the air but tried to ignore it. He reminded himself to stay calm and not give them any reason to question him. When he reached his car, the 2 officers stepped out. Their steps were deliberate, almost like they were closing in. One of them called out, asking him to stop and show his identification. His heart rate quickened slightly, not from fear but from the unfairness of the situation. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was being treated like a suspect. The man raised his hand slightly and said politely that he was happy to show his ID. He explained that he had just finished work and was heading home. His voice was calm, steady, and respectful, but the officers seemed unimpressed. They continued to ask questions, their tone firm and slightly accusatory. It was clear that they had made a judgment about him before knowing anything about him. He noticed a few pedestrians slowing down to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. He understood why. There was a tension in the air that felt wrong. No one likes to see someone being treated unfairly. The man remained composed. He didn't raise his voice or show anger. He knew that staying calm was important, not just for himself but for anyone watching. One officer stepped closer, leaning slightly toward him. He asked why he was in that area, implying that he didn't belong there. The man explained again, politely, that he had parked his car in the lot every day for years. He worked nearby and was just walking back to his car, but the officer didn't seem to care about his explanation. His body language suggested he had already decided that the man was up to something. The man noticed the subtle changes in the officer's tone. There was a hint of impatience mixed with suspicion. It was clear that his race had played a role in how they treated him. The man had experienced situations like this before, but it never felt easier. Each time he had to remind himself to stay calm, to not let anger take over, and to handle the situation with dignity. He reached into his bag slowly, making sure his movements were visible and non-threatening. He pulled out his wallet and held his ID clearly in his hand. The officer stepped closer, asking for it again in a firmer tone. He handed it over without a word, keeping his expression neutral. He wanted to show that he was cooperative, even though he felt the injustice sharply. The officers examined the ID briefly. Their eyes moved across his name and information. The man noticed their expressions. There was curiosity mixed with doubt. They had clearly not expected what they were about to learn. Yet they didn't say anything at first. The silence between them felt heavy, like the tension had grown denser with every passing second. The man spoke calmly, addressing their unspoken questions. He mentioned his work in the city, his usual routine, and the importance of his role. He didn't reveal too much yet. He wanted to see how they would react without the influence of rank or title. He wanted to see if basic respect could be given based on his behavior and honesty. The officers listened, but their faces didn't change much. One of them made a comment about being cautious in the area, hinting at his prejudice without saying it outright. The man nodded politely, acknowledging their concern but not agreeing with their assumptions. He kept his tone calm and steady, showing patience despite the unfairness. A few pedestrians had stopped by now, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered to each other, wondering why the man was being treated this way. Others took out their phones, recording quietly. The man noticed but didn't react. He had learned that public attention could sometimes escalate situations, but it could also help bring accountability. The man's mind was clear. He thought about the next steps carefully. He knew he had to handle this without anger. He wanted the officers to understand that behavior and assumptions mattered more than appearances. He wanted them to see that respect should be given to everyone, regardless of race or background. He made a polite suggestion, asking if there was a way to resolve the situation calmly. He kept his posture relaxed, his hands visible and his voice gentle. His goal was not to challenge the officers aggressively, but to demonstrate that cooperation and honesty were stronger than prejudice and suspicion. The officers seemed momentarily taken aback by his calmness. Their tone softened slightly, but the suspicion remained. They were not used to being met with patience and dignity when they had already decided someone was guilty of nothing more than walking in a certain neighborhood. The man's presence, calm and unshakable, began to create a small shift in the atmosphere. Despite the minor change, the tension was still high. The man could feel the underlying assumptions that had led to this confrontation. He thought about how often people were judged unfairly, how many others had to deal with similar encounters without the ability or position to remain unchallenged. He silently hoped that this interaction could in some way become a lesson. As he stood there, the city around them continued its normal rhythm. Cars moved slowly, people walked past, and the sun lowered toward the horizon. Time seemed to stretch as the officers continued to examine him, unaware that their assumptions were about to be proven wrong in a surprising way. The man's patience and dignity remained intact, silently demanding acknowledgement of basic human respect. The first part of this encounter had set the stage for something much larger. The man's calm response, his clear and respectful communication, and his composure in the face of bias had begun to shift the energy. The officers' assumptions were being tested, and the public, though silent for the moment, was watching closely. The man's approach was simple. Stay calm, be clear, and not let anger or frustration control his actions. Each word, each movement was deliberate. He had faced prejudice before, but he had learned that composure was the most powerful tool. By staying grounded, he showed that dignity could not be taken away by assumptions or fear. As the sun dipped lower, the light turned softer and warmer. Shadows grew longer on the street, and the city began to feel quieter. The man waited patiently, holding his ID, calmly explaining his presence and subtly challenging the unfair assumptions that had led to this moment. This quiet, steady approach contrasted sharply with the officer's initial aggression, creating a tension that was both uncomfortable and revealing. The officers finally seemed to pause, as if reconsidering their approach. Their previous confidence had been shaken by the man's calm assertiveness. They looked at each other, uncertain about how to proceed. The man's composure had disrupted the narrative they had constructed before even speaking to him. Bystanders shifted slightly, sensing the change. Some whispered to each other, noting the strange reversal in energy. The man, standing with quiet dignity, had already made an impact without raising his voice or causing a scene. The city's rhythm continued around them, unaware of the personal battle unfolding on this small street. As the first part of the encounter came to a close, the man's inner thoughts remained focused. He reflected on the injustice, the importance of patience, and the need to handle the situation carefully. The officers, still suspicious, had not yet learned the full truth about the man's identity. That revelation would come in the next moments, changing everything and leaving a lasting impression on everyone involved. For now, he remained calm, polite, and composed, showing that integrity and patience could hold power even in the face of prejudice and misunderstanding. The tension hung thick in the air as the man waited patiently. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him, sharp and unyielding, measuring every move he made. Each question they asked seemed unnecessary, a repetition that served more to assert power than to gather information. He remained calm, answering each question with clarity and politeness, showing no sign of irritation or fear. His composure was steady, like a rock in a river, unmoved by the turbulence around him. One of the officers leaned closer, narrowing his eyes as if trying to see past the man's calm exterior. "What are you really doing here?" he asked, voice tinged with suspicion. The man responded carefully, explaining again that he had finished his work for the day and was walking to his car. He mentioned nothing about his military role yet, choosing instead to demonstrate honesty and transparency through his words and actions. The officer's tone hardened. He gestured vaguely toward the parking lot, implying that people like him didn't belong there. The comment was subtle, but it carried the weight of judgment. The man felt a familiar twinge of frustration, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he nodded politely and continued to answer without defensiveness, emphasizing cooperation rather than conflict. A few pedestrians had gathered at a distance, curious about what was happening. Some whispered to each other, noting the tense interaction. The man noticed the stares but didn't let them distract him. He understood that public attention could be both a risk and a protection. In situations like this, keeping control over one's own emotions was essential. He focused on clarity, keeping his movements visible and his hands relaxed at his sides. The officers continued to question him, asking about his destination, his schedule, and his reasons for being in the area. Their questions carried an undertone of doubt, as if they couldn't believe his simple answers. The man responded each time with calm precision, his voice steady, his explanations concise. He avoided confrontation, instead letting his demeanor communicate confidence and honesty. One officer took a step back, muttering to his partner. They exchanged a brief, tense look. The man observed this but remained outwardly neutral. He understood that perception could change in a moment, but only if handled carefully. He wanted the officers to see him not as a threat, but as a human being deserving of respect. Every detail mattered: posture, eye contact, tone of voice. He had learned these lessons through experience, knowing that control over self could influence even those who had prejudged him. The man spoke again, calmly stating that he wanted to resolve the situation peacefully. He emphasized that he had done nothing wrong and had no intention of causing trouble. He noticed a flicker of doubt cross the officer's face, a hint that the man's steady demeanor was beginning to shift the dynamic. Still, the suspicion lingered, unspoken but present. The officers had started with assumptions, and now those assumptions were being tested in real time. As they spoke, a gentle breeze passed through the street, ruffling papers in the man's bag. The sunlight had lowered further, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. The city's rhythm continued around them. Cars moved along slowly, pedestrians passed by. But in that small space, time seemed to slow. Every word, every gesture carried weight, as if the world had paused to watch the interaction unfold. The man noticed the subtle body language of the officers. One of them shifted from a confrontational stance to a slightly more cautious posture. His hand moved toward his belt, hesitating. The man kept his movements open, relaxed, and non-threatening, showing that he posed no danger. His calmness contrasted sharply with the officer's lingering tension, highlighting the imbalance created by assumptions rather than facts. He spoke again, this time asking if there was any way they could resolve the matter quickly and respectfully. He emphasized cooperation, offering small gestures of goodwill, a polite nod, an explanation of his routine, and assurance that he had nothing to hide. Each action was deliberate, reinforcing the message that respect and honesty could calm even the most tense situations. The officers exchanged another glance. Their uncertainty grew as they realized that the man was not reacting in the way they expected. He did not show anger, fear, or frustration. Instead, he maintained a composed presence, demonstrating control over the situation without confrontation. The quiet authority of his behavior began to challenge the officers' initial assumptions, slowly eroding the confidence they had started with. Meanwhile, the small crowd of bystanders grew slightly. Some whispered encouragement, others simply observed in silence. A few recorded the interaction on their phones, capturing the tension for the world to see. The man remained aware but unfazed, focusing on the conversation in front of him. He knew that public attention could escalate matters, but it could also hold the officers accountable. The officer who had been most suspicious finally spoke again, his voice firmer but tinged with hesitation. He asked for more details about the man's work and his schedule. The man answered with calm clarity, sharing just enough information to be honest without revealing his full position. He wanted them to see that he was trustworthy and credible based on behavior, not rank. A moment of silence fell. The officers seemed unsure how to proceed. The man's patience had created a subtle but powerful shift. His steady demeanor and respectful communication had begun to challenge the prejudices that had shaped the encounter from the start. He had not raised his voice, he had not argued, and yet he had started to change the energy around him. The man thought quietly to himself about the broader implications of this encounter. How many others had faced similar assumptions without the ability to respond with patience and composure? How often were people judged based on appearance rather than actions? He reflected on these questions silently, maintaining focus on the immediate interaction while carrying the weight of these thoughts. As the sun continued to set, The light softened, bathing the street in a warm, golden glow. Shadows stretched across the pavement, and the city began to quiet slightly as evening approached. The man's calm presence contrasted sharply with the tension in the officers, creating a scene of quiet yet profound imbalance. Every passerby who noticed the interaction could feel the tension and the disparity in assumptions. He remained patient, answering questions without defensiveness, keeping his gestures open and visible, and maintaining eye contact that conveyed confidence and honesty. He understood that composure in the face of prejudice was a form of quiet strength, one that could influence even those who had started with the wrong assumptions. The officers continued to speak in low voices, consulting briefly with one another. The man observed this, remaining calm and polite. He did not intervene in their conversation, allowing them to process what they were seeing. His patience was deliberate, a strategy honed over years of navigating similar situations. He knew that revealing too much too soon could create confusion or escalation, so he continued to maintain his measured approach. The scene had become a silent lesson in human behavior. The man's calm, respectful responses stood in stark contrast to the officer's initial aggression. He demonstrated that dignity and patience could create a powerful shift, even in situations where bias and assumption initially held sway. The bystanders, though silent for the most part, were witnessing a subtle but important confrontation between prejudice and composure. Finally, the man spoke again, suggesting that perhaps they could resolve the situation quickly if they all approached it with honesty and respect. His voice remained calm, unwavering, and steady. The officers seemed to hesitate, realizing that their earlier assumptions were being challenged not with confrontation, but with simple human dignity. The man's inner thoughts were focused on maintaining this balance. He reflected on the importance of staying composed, on the strength of patience, and on the power of respectful communication. He understood that the outcome of this encounter would not just depend on his words, but on the subtle ways he presented himself through every gesture, every pause, every measured response. As the evening deepened and the shadows grew longer, the man continued to answer questions politely and clearly. The tension remained, but the balance of power was shifting. The officers, who had approached with suspicion and bias, were now beginning to question their own assumptions. The man had not raised his voice or challenged them aggressively, yet he had started to influence the situation in ways that words alone could not fully capture. The bystanders remained, quietly observing, some whispering about the unexpected calmness of the man in the face of prejudice. Others were taking mental notes about how dignity and patience could confront bias. The scene was unfolding slowly, each moment adding layers to the tension and the lesson it carried. The man's approach was simple, but powerful. He stayed calm, respectful, and clear. He answered questions honestly, maintained visible and non-threatening gestures, and allowed the officers to see that cooperation and integrity could override initial assumptions. He demonstrated that human behavior, not rank or fear, could guide interactions even in tense situations. By the end of this part of the encounter, the officers had begun to show subtle signs of reconsideration. Their aggressive posture had softened slightly, their words carried less certainty, and their assumptions were starting to be challenged. The man had not revealed his full identity yet, but his composed and patient behavior had already created a small shift, demonstrating that dignity and calm could influence even those who had approached with bias and suspicion. The city continued around them, unaware of the personal lessons being learned on this small street. The man remained composed, polite, and steady, showing that integrity and patience could hold power even in the face of prejudice. The first steps of understanding, though subtle, had begun to take shape, setting the stage for the revelation that would soon leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. The tension had reached a delicate balance. The man had remained calm and polite, answering every question the officers asked with clarity and honesty. The subtle shift in the officers' demeanor was noticeable, but they still carried the weight of their assumptions. They did not yet realize the full truth of who they were speaking to, and the moment of revelation was approaching. The man finally decided it was time to reveal a part of his identity. He spoke with a calm but firm tone, letting the words land carefully. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I hold a position in the United States military. I am the Deputy Commander of U.S. Central Command." His words hung in the air, clear and deliberate, For a moment, neither officer spoke. Their expressions shifted almost instantly. Shock replaced suspicion and the tone of their bodies changed. One officer took a step back, his eyes widening. The other officer's jaw tightened as he tried to process the information. They had approached the situation with preconceived ideas, and suddenly, the entire perspective had changed. The bystanders, who had been quietly observing, also reacted. Some gasped softly while others whispered to each other, realizing the significance of the revelation. Phones were still recording, capturing the unexpected turn of events. The man's calm manner had remained unchanged, but now it carried a different weight. Authority, experience, and dignity all radiated from him without aggression or arrogance. The officers struggled to find words. Their earlier questions now seemed trivial and misinformed. The man's polite but firm approach forced them to reconsider their behavior. The city around them continued its rhythm, but in that small area, the energy had shifted completely. The officers' earlier assumptions, which had dictated their behavior, had been proven wrong in the most unexpected way. The man noticed their hesitation and allowed a brief pause, letting the reality of the situation sink in. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand recognition. His calm revelation was enough to challenge the narrative they had created. The lesson was clear. Respect should not be based on assumptions but on the recognition of humanity and honesty. One officer finally spoke, his voice quiet and uncertain. "I didn't know," he said. The other officer simply nodded, his previous confidence replaced by awkward realization. The man responded with calm dignity. He acknowledged their apology without harshness, making it clear that the lesson was not just about rank, but about fairness, respect, and the danger of jumping to conclusions. The man explained that he understood the challenges law enforcement officers face daily, and he emphasized that his goal was not to shame or humiliate. Instead, he wanted to show that assumptions based on appearance or race could lead to unnecessary tension and misunderstanding. His words were measured, teaching without aggression, illustrating that calm and reason could create understanding even in moments of prejudice. The officers listened intently, their body language slowly relaxing. They began to understand that the man's authority did not come solely from his military rank, but also from his composure, clarity, and ability to handle the situation respectfully. The tension in the air eased slightly, replaced by reflection and awareness. Bystanders continued to watch, their whispers acknowledging the unusual turn of events. Some nodded in recognition of the man's patience and dignity. Others shared looks of surprise and admiration, realizing that real power often came from restraint and respectful communication, rather than aggression or intimidation. The man continued to speak calmly, offering insight into his experiences with bias and assumptions. He mentioned that situations like this were unfortunately common, and that how people respond could make a significant difference. His words carried authority not because of his rank alone, but because of the human-centered approach he had maintained throughout the encounter. He highlighted that respect should be universal, not conditional. The officers nodded subtly, absorbing the message. They began to reflect on their own actions, recognizing how their assumptions had influenced their behavior. The revelation of the man's position had transformed the interaction, but the underlying lesson was far deeper. Dignity and patience had the power to teach in ways authority alone could not. The man then addressed the bystanders indirectly, knowing their presence could amplify the importance of the moment. Without pointing fingers or seeking validation, he demonstrated through his words and calm demeanor that prejudice could be countered with composure and honesty. The subtle power of the situation was evident to everyone around. The officer's posture continued to change, their earlier aggressive stance replaced by a more reflective and respectful approach. They asked a few clarifying questions, no longer with suspicion but with genuine interest and acknowledgement. The man answered with the same calm precision, reinforcing the lesson of patience and dignity. The city continued to move around them, unaware of the personal and social lessons unfolding in the small pocket of space. The man's approach created a ripple effect. Bystanders, officers, and even the casual passers-by were exposed to a rare moment of human teaching through conduct rather than confrontation. It was an unspoken lesson on fairness, understanding, and the power of controlled composure. After a few minutes, the officers began to apologize more sincerely. They admitted that their initial approach had been influenced by assumptions and that they recognized the unfairness of their behavior. The man accepted the apologies graciously, reinforcing that the purpose of the revelation was not punishment, but awareness. He took a moment to explain the broader implications of such encounters. He spoke about the importance of fairness, the dangers of racial profiling, and the power of patient communication in diffusing tension. His words carried weight because they were grounded in lived experience and demonstrated through action. He had maintained composure throughout, proving that integrity could command respect without aggression. The officers, now more reflective, began to engage in a dialogue rather than interrogation. They asked questions about his work, his responsibilities, and his experience in the military. The man answered with humility, showing that authority need not be arrogant. The interaction had transformed from a tense confrontation into a respectful conversation. Bystanders continued to watch, some nodding, others whispering in recognition of the man's ability to turn a potentially negative situation into a lesson in human respect. The subtle shift was evident. Authority combined with calm composure had the power to transform perception and behavior. The man reflected internally on how often similar situations might occur in different forms and contexts. He understood that not everyone had the chance to reveal a high-profile identity, but everyone could respond with patience, clarity, and dignity. His calm approach had created an environment for learning and reflection, demonstrating the universality of respect and human decency. The officers continued to ask questions, but now with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. They were learning not just about the man's role, but about the broader lesson of human interaction. The man answered patiently, illustrating that the way one carries oneself, even in difficult circumstances, can have a profound impact. As the evening deepened, the light softened further. The golden hue of the setting sun created a quiet backdrop for this unusual interaction. The man's calm demeanor, his measured responses, and his ability to remain composed had transformed the encounter. What had begun as suspicion and potential hostility had evolved into understanding, reflection, and a subtle teaching moment. The officers began to take a step back, their initial posture of authority now tempered by awareness. They realized that assumptions had misled them, and that the man's calm and polite approach had provided them with a rare opportunity for reflection. The man's revelation of his identity had shifted the power dynamics, but it was his composure and dignity that had truly guided the interaction. The bystanders continued to observe, many silently absorbing the lesson. The man's ability to maintain calm in the face of bias, to answer with honesty, and to reveal his identity in a controlled and deliberate manner demonstrated the power of human-centered behavior. The incident had evolved from a confrontation into a moment of subtle yet meaningful teaching. Finally, the man prepared to end the conversation. He expressed his hope that such encounters could lead to greater awareness and understanding. He emphasized that respect should never be conditional, and that patience, honesty, and composure were tools that could foster better human interaction everywhere. The officers nodded, their expressions reflecting recognition, humility, and a newfound awareness. The first major revelation had concluded. The tension, while not completely gone, had shifted into reflection. The officers had learned an important lesson about assumptions and bias. The man had demonstrated, through both revelation and calm behavior, that integrity, patience, and human-centered conduct could guide even the most difficult situations. The bystanders had witnessed a subtle yet powerful moment of social learning, one that would likely remain in their minds long after they walked away. The tension in the street began to ease, but the weight of the encounter lingered. The man had revealed his position as Deputy Commander of U.S. Central Command, and the officers had begun to see the situation differently. Their initial aggression had softened, replaced with a cautious respect. The man, however, maintained his calm demeanor, making it clear that the lesson was not just about his rank, but about fairness, patience, and the power of human dignity. The officers muttered apologies, their voices quieter and more genuine than before. They acknowledged that their behavior had been influenced by assumptions and bias, and the man nodded, accepting their words without showing any bitterness. His approach was firm but gentle, teaching without anger, illustrating how composure and understanding could foster change. He wanted them to understand that respect should never be conditional, based on race or perceived authority, but given to every individual. Bystanders continued to watch silently, many holding their phones to capture the moment. The man's calmness, combined with the revelation of his role, created an unusual scene in the middle of the street. Passers-by whispered among themselves, noting how patience and dignity could influence even those who initially approached with prejudice. The man's actions became a silent lesson for everyone present. The officers asked a few questions about his work and his responsibilities, their curiosity genuine now rather than confrontational. The man answered calmly, providing insight into his role without boasting. His words were clear and measured, emphasizing that authority carried with it responsibility and the need to act with integrity. The officers listened attentively, absorbing more than just the facts. They were taking in the lesson of composure and respect. After a moment, the man began to reflect aloud, speaking about the broader issue of racial profiling and assumptions. He highlighted how often people were judged unfairly based on appearance and how damaging such assumptions could be. His tone was calm, not accusatory, but instructive. He made it clear that while he had the privilege of position and authority, the principles he was sharing applied universally. Everyone could choose to act with patience, fairness, and respect. The officers, visibly affected by his words, nodded in acknowledgement. They began to understand the gravity of their initial behavior and the importance of self-reflection. The man's calmness had allowed them to hear his message without defensiveness, and his approach demonstrated the power of patience over confrontation. The situation had shifted from a tense encounter to a teaching moment, and the officers were beginning to internalize the lesson. The bystanders, still watching quietly, began to murmur among themselves. Some commented on the man's poise and patience, noting how rare it was to see someone handle such an encounter with dignity. Others whispered about the officer's reaction, realizing that assumptions could be challenged without hostility. The entire scene, while small in scope, carried a larger social message about fairness, respect, and human behavior. The man spoke further about how encounters like this could be transformed through simple actions. Maintaining composure, speaking clearly, and refusing to respond with anger. He emphasized that these qualities were not signs of weakness but of strength. He had handled the situation in a way that was both respectful and effective, showing that even in the face of bias, one could guide interactions toward understanding. The officers listened quietly, their posture now more relaxed. They asked a few clarifying questions about his work, showing genuine interest and curiosity. The man answered with humility, explaining that his authority did not make him superior, but it came with the responsibility to act with fairness and integrity. He made it clear that the lessons of patience, respect, and dignity applied to every human interaction, regardless of rank or status. The man's reflections continued, highlighting the importance of accountability. He explained that understanding the impact of one's actions was crucial, especially for those in positions of authority. The officers nodded slowly, absorbing the message. The tension that had once dominated the encounter was now replaced by a quiet understanding. Both the man and the officers had moved from confrontation to reflection, creating a moment of learning that went beyond the immediate situation. He then addressed the importance of listening, not just speaking. He explained that communication was effective only when both sides were willing to hear and understand. The officers, by now more composed, seemed to grasp the significance of this advice. The man's calmness and clarity had opened a space for dialogue and self-reflection, something that might not have been possible if the encounter had escalated into anger or hostility. The street around them continued its routine, but the energy in that small space had changed. Passers-by, witnessing the transformation, felt the subtle power of the encounter. The man's approach had created a ripple effect, demonstrating that respectful behavior, honesty, and patience could influence even those who started with bias. The officers, too, had been transformed by the experience, gaining a moment of awareness that might guide them in future interactions. The man encouraged the officers to consider how they approached situations in the future. He emphasized that everyone deserved respect and that assumptions based on appearance or race were harmful and often unnecessary. His words were steady and measured, delivering a lesson in human decency without confrontation. The officers listened intently, nodding in agreement, their previous defensiveness replaced with reflection. He paused for a moment, allowing the message to sink in. The bystanders, still watching, seemed to recognize the quiet power of the encounter. No one had raised their voice, yet the situation had transformed completely. The man had shown that dignity, patience, and respect could overcome assumptions and bias, turning a tense moment into a meaningful lesson. The officers apologized again, more sincerely this time. They acknowledged their mistake and thanked the man for his patience and guidance. He accepted their apologies with grace, reinforcing that the goal was understanding, not retribution. His response further emphasized the lesson: humility, composure, and kindness could create change even in challenging situations. The man began to step back toward his car, signaling that the encounter was coming to a close. He reminded the officers and bystanders alike that respect and fairness should guide interactions at all times. His calm departure left a lasting impression on everyone present. The officers, still processing the experience, remained quiet for a moment, reflecting on their actions and the lesson they had received. As he walked to his car, the man noticed the subtle shifts in the expressions of the bystanders. Some nodded in understanding, others whispered about the unexpected lesson they had witnessed. The entire encounter, though brief, had created a meaningful moment of reflection and awareness, highlighting the power of patience, dignity, and human-centered behavior. The officers watched him leave, their demeanor changed. They had begun with assumptions and bias, but they ended with a sense of reflection and awareness. The man had taught them, not through force or anger, but through calmness, honesty, and dignity. The lesson was clear. Respect and fairness were not optional, and even small actions could create meaningful change. The city continued around them, unaware of the profound encounter that had just taken place on that quiet street. The man's calm and patient approach had transformed a potentially negative situation into a lesson of human decency. Passers-by would carry the memory of the moment, perhaps reflecting on their own assumptions and behavior in the future. As he reached his car, the man paused briefly, taking a deep breath. The evening air was cool and refreshing, a gentle reminder that life moved on even after intense moments. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had handled the situation with integrity and composure. The lesson he had imparted was not about rank or authority alone, but about the universal principles of respect, patience, and dignity. He opened the car door and settled inside, the sounds of the city surrounding him. The encounter had ended, but the impact remained. Both officers and bystanders had witnessed a demonstration of calm strength, a model for handling bias and assumptions in everyday life. The man's patience and composure had turned a tense confrontation into a meaningful reflection on human behavior. The officers, left on the street, exchanged a few quiet words. They discussed the lesson they had just received, acknowledging the importance of self-awareness and fairness. The man's approach had provided them with an opportunity to learn and reflect, something that might influence their future interactions. The subtle power of his behavior, combined with the revelation of his role, had transformed a challenging encounter into a moment of growth. The man started the car and drove away, leaving the street behind. The memory of the encounter lingered in the air, a reminder of the power of composure, patience, and respect. The officers and bystanders alike would carry the lesson forward, recognizing that dignity and understanding could overcome assumptions and bias. The encounter had become more than a simple interaction. It was a human story of integrity, teaching, and reflection. The man drove away from the street, but his thoughts remained on the encounter. Even though it had ended, the lessons it held were clear and unforgettable. He reflected on how quickly assumptions could shape behavior, and how powerful patience, composure, and respect could be in turning a tense situation into a moment of reflection and understanding. He thought about the officers. They had started with suspicion, influenced by bias and preconceived ideas, but they had ended with awareness and reflection,